And for our final speaker in the community engagement strand of MSU Talks 2014, Dr. Mike Stout. Professor Stout is Associate Professor of Sociology at Missouri State University and the Director of the Missouri State Center for Community Engagement. His research interests are in the area of applied public sociology, with a specific focus on economic inequality and its relationship to social capital, civic engagement, and community and economic development. Dr. Stout is also the coordinator of the Ozarks Regional Social Capital Study, an ongoing project that tracks levels of social capital and civic engagement in Southwest Missouri.
Thank you for coming out today to hear this talk. And while I am kind of the closing speaker for the community engagement strand, I think one of the interesting things about Missouri State is the ways that all three of the pillars of the public affairs mission interact to lead to developing leaders who are culturally competent and who are also engaged citizens. And so all three of those make up the public affairs mission, and we talk about them as three different things, but it's important to know that they do relate to each other in a bunch of different ways. What I want to talk about a little bit today is on the importance of community engagement. Why should students, faculty, staff, administration at a university like Missouri State bother with trying to produce opportunities to get students out in the community to develop their leadership potential and to make them culturally competent? It seems like nowadays the biggest reason that people are interested in education is so that they can get a better paying job, right? We know that people with bachelor's degrees, on average over the course of their lifetime, earn about $1 million more throughout the course of their life than a person without a bachelor's degree. So one reason that we have universities is so that you can develop your own skills, your own potential, and make you more valuable in the labor market, right? Economists and sociologists refer to that as human capital. It's the investments you make in your education and in your skills that make you more valuable in the labor market and give you more opportunity for economic mobility. And that's certainly an important role for universities and other education institutions to provide for people. On the other hand, we have a long tradition in the United States of education for citizenship, for understanding what life is like, what life means in a democracy, and what the responsibilities are for the people who live in that democracy. And so Thomas Jefferson, who created the first public education system in Virginia in the United States a couple of hundred years ago, primarily wanted people, and this was landowning white males who were the only people who were really considered citizens at that point, wanted to have opportunities for them to be well-read, well-learned in the classics that led to the framing of our Constitution and that went into the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments of the Constitution, so that people could understand that along with the freedom that we got as a result of establishing a democratic republic, there were certain responsibilities that we hold as citizens in order to keep those freedoms. And so economics is important. Incomes are important. But there's a certain element of citizenship that, without it, wouldn't allow our economy to work. It wouldn't allow other parts of our society to work. And when we see, like we've been seeing over the past 30 years in the United States, that on average, fewer people are becoming engaged in their community. 60% of Americans couldn't pass a U.S. citizenship test if they were given a U.S. citizenship test, meaning they don't understand the separation of powers in government. They don't understand how government works, how a bill becomes law, how people get elected or appointed to particular political positions and such. So there's an element of community engagement that creates a dynamic in American life that allows us to prosper in other ways. in the country. And the interesting thing is, the skills that you use for community engagement, the ability to think critically, the ability to collaborate, the ability to organize activities, fundraise, go door to door campaigning, there's political and non-political things that you can do. All of those things are actually skills that are becoming more and more useful in the 21st century workplace. And so these skills aren't strictly limited to the things that you're going to be doing for a living after you graduate, and they're not necessarily limited to your ability to become engaged in your community when you become settled wherever it is that you decide to go. So it's important to understand that at the very foundation of the United States is this civic obligation and this responsibility that we have as citizens to understand the world around us, to understand what the nature of problems facing our community are, to be able to actively get involved in addressing those issues rather than leaving it up to the government or leaving it up to some other outside entity from outside of our communities. One of the things that makes us unique is that we have that ability to come together on a voluntary basis to solve problems in the US. And I don't think that's something that we talk about enough in this country. And it's something that I know for sure many people in the United States don't take seriously, whether it's in the political realm, where you saw with the last election that we had locally, approximately 12% of registered voters showed up to vote. There were 5 constitutional amendments to the Missouri Constitution on that particular ballot, not to mention all of the people who are running for primary to become general election candidates. When we're adding amendments to our Constitution, that's something that we need to educate ourselves on, because what we're doing is we're giving the state more power and we're taking power away from local areas, because what's in our state constitution trumps municipal charters, trumps the city government rules, just like what federal law states trumps what state law says. And if we aren't educating ourselves with this and we're allowing special interests to dictate the terms of the discussion, then we're going to get a government that no longer works for the people, by the people, but it's a government that works for special interests and by special interests. 12% is a very low number for a turnout for an election. How many people, by a show of hands, actually showed up to vote in the last election? Yeah. About 12% of you, it looks like. And thank you for being honest, because a lot of times in surveys, when we ask questions about voting, anywhere between 80 and 90% of people said that they vote. And the highest turnout for an election we've had in the last 30 years was in the 2008 election, and that number approached about 60%, right? So we know the official statistics differ from what people volunteer when they're asked that question. In the social sciences, we call that social desirability bias, right? People know that you're supposed to vote, so when we ask them a question on a survey, they say, yeah, sure, I voted. But those numbers never match up. So there's several components that are necessary in order to have effective community engagement. And by effective, I mean things that are sustainable and things that are actually addressing the issues that you're getting involved with when you get engaged in the community. The first thing is information, and accurate information. If you are not informed about what the issue is, what the causes of the issue are, and what the root problem is that you're trying to deal with, then how are you ever going to be able to fix the problem? Right? If you're not aware that a problem exists, then there's no way to be able to deal with it effectively. And so, in the political arena, we talk about informed voters versus uninformed voters, right? You always have the people who say, oh, I'm just going to vote Republican because I'm a Republican and I don't care where the candidate stands on the issue. I'm not going to bother learning about these things. Or I'm a Democrat, I'm just voting straight Democrat, without getting to know the candidates and their stances on the issues. One of the things we do particularly well at Missouri State University is we provide opportunities for people to learn about issues that are facing students on campus, people living in the community and the region around us, statewide issues, national and international issues. Now, whether or not you take advantage of those opportunities to obtain that information is another story. A second piece that is essential for solving problems through community engagement is the ability to work together across different kinds of social boundaries. In terms of the language we use in social sciences, we call this bridging social capital. In America, people tend to be connected to others who are very similar to themselves, based on your level of education. Age is a big part of it. Occupation, socioeconomic status, religious beliefs, race or ethnic background, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, right? All of these things that we hear about how different we are as Americans. And all of these things are wedge issues that politicians have been able to use in order to get elected for quite some time now. In order for communities to be able to work together to solve problems, we have to understand what about being a part of that community connects us all together. What's that common thread that ties us together despite our religious beliefs, despite our gender differences, despite our social class differences? And how do we then bring people together in order to actually understand those common things that we all want? You can ask somebody who's African American what they want for their children, and you're going to get the same answer that you get from a white American, right? They want their child to have the best opportunity to grow and develop in an environment where they'll be able to maximize their potential, and they'll be able to contribute to society, and they'll be able to get a good job, and they'll be able to raise a family. Survey after survey after survey shows this, that despite what people want to believe about cultural differences, there are some things that we all hold in common for the most part in the United States. So, getting accurate information and establishing a network of people who can form a coalition to become engaged around that issue is also very important. Every social movement that's been successful in the United States has involved different people and different organizations who may have completely different views on many issues, but for a particular issue, say civil rights, they have that issue in common, and they've been able to come together around that and effectively organize for collective action that has led to the passage of laws, the abolition of slavery. We had to have a war over that one. But the passage of laws, the changing of charters at the city level to make sure more people have opportunities. And one thing about having these diverse relationships is that it provides different perspectives on issues. So, new study just came out, showed that close to 90% of white Americans did not have a person of color in their immediate social circle of connections. Like I said, we tend to segregate ourselves into groups who look like us, who grew up around us and where we come from. We live in a highly segregated society, so that's not a very surprising statistic. Turns out the same thing in the African American community. More than 90% don't have a white friend in their immediate social circle. And you might say, well, why is that a problem? Well, let me ask you a question. In the 21st century economy, if you're a professional and you're trying to get a job, how do you go about doing it? This isn't a rhetorical question. I'd like an actual answer, please.
LinkedIn.
What's that?
LinkedIn.
LinkedIn? Okay, some people use LinkedIn to connect with people, right? But how do you find your connections for LinkedIn?
Social network.
Yeah, through people you already know, for the most part, right? How many people think that professionals, people with college degrees, are looking through the classified ads for newspapers, and that's the way the majority of people get their job? Raise your hand if you think that's the way the majority of people get their job. Okay, so if you don't think it's through the classified section of the newspaper or online, and there's some stuff going on with social media now that helps build some good networks, but what is the number one way that people get their jobs? I really want an answer here.
You know somebody in the field.
Yes, word of mouth, right? You have a friend that gives a reference for you, gets you in for that interview because they vouched for you, you get that opportunity to interview and you get that job. Now, what's the problem with that approach to getting jobs? Given what we know about who's in the position of leadership in most of our major economic institutions, whether they're corporations or other types of organizations and small businesses, those types of things. What's the problem with that?
Only people with connections.
Right. If 90% of white Americans virtually have zero connections to anybody other than other white Americans, who do you think is going to get referred for those jobs? Other white Americans, right? We call this institutional racism. That's part of the problem in this country, is that we've become so segregated socially, politically, culturally, and economically that it's taking away opportunities from the groups who traditionally haven't had access to those higher level positions in our society. So by diversifying your networks, we can start solving problems through engaging with people who are different from us, issues like institutional racism. And that's just I teach the race course in the sociology program, and it's an example I use all the time, right? The majority of people who run things in this country tend to be older white males, right? And I'm getting to be a middle-aged white male, so I understand how these things work. But by definition, because we've had a history of segregation in this country, because we've had a history of unequal access to economic resources and opportunities, it's become built into the very structure, the social fabric of most of our major institutions in society. There's no economic incentive for businesses to change this themselves, although there are more and more Fortune 500 companies who are hiring diversity coordinators and are trying to reach out into different areas to recruit and coordinate and do those things. We know that there's affirmative action laws and things for certain industries and businesses. But none of that would even be possible if people weren't talking about the lack of diversity and the lack of opportunity as an issue. In order to understand that issue, you have to understand the history of this country. You have to understand how different opportunity structures operate, how different institutions change over time or don't change over time, and you have to be able to use that information to effectively engage with those institutions in order to make a change happen. How many people volunteer for something in this room? Okay, it's pretty good, about half of you volunteer for something in this room. When you volunteered, how many of you volunteered doing something that actually involved engaging materials that you were learning in your classes in terms of some theory or some methodology or some understanding of a substantive issue, and you had the opportunity to volunteer for a cause that you actually care about? Raise your hand if you got to do that. That's good, right? That's one of the things that makes for effective community engagement or civic engagement, is the ability to use what you learn in the classroom to make the world a better place. That's part of the value of the public affairs mission here at Missouri State. I focused on politics, I focused on the economy, but let's just talk about other things like neighborhoods. You heard the last presenter talking about the importance of what he called third places, right? Well, you can think about society as being comprised of three major types of institutions. We have economic institutions, which obviously provide people with opportunities to earn more money, to have a job, to have some sense of stability, although there are fewer and fewer of those types of jobs available nowadays. We have political institutions or institutions of government who have the ability to write laws, pass bills, distribute tax resources for things like roads and highways and infrastructures. And then we have the third sector, or the civic sector, or civil society, depending on what your frame of reference is that you're talking about it from. And this is made up of all the nonprofits, philanthropies, families, churches, and other places where people gather voluntarily to act for the common good. When one of those three areas has a disproportionate influence on the others, it throws society out of balance. And so the question is, should our communities and our politics be working in the interest of big companies and corporations and special interests? Or do we want to have a country where our economics, our politics, are operating in the interest of strengthening our civil society, are operating to make sure that we have stronger marriages, that we have more engagement through faith-based activities, that we have the ability to go out to public parks and have public meetings or political protests or whatever we want to do. What we've witnessed over the last 30 years is the development of an ideology that everything should give way to the economic sector, to the private sector, and that all of our problems in society can be solved by the quote-unquote free market. At the same time that this ideology has become prominent, particularly in our political institutions, we've seen economic inequality widen to levels that we haven't seen since the Gilded Age at the end of the 19th century. We've seen a decline of middle-class lifestyles, largely due to the dissolution of unions, the changing of the tax code by large money special interests in our politics, along with economic inequality comes lower levels of trust, which leads to higher levels of social isolation. So we know fewer people are engaging with others, even in terms of just their regular friendship networks. I'm not even talking about trying to bridge other types of networks, right? We basically say that if people aren't doing well, it's because their own choices led to that. But we never talk about the broader structure that people live in that influence those choices. In the social sciences, we refer to that structure as an opportunity structure. And depending on the family you're born into these days, we can do a better job of predicting where you're going to end up by the time you're an adult than using any other indicator that we've previously been able to use. So your zip code and your family name now means more in the US than it did 50 years ago. 60% of new millionaires in the United States are the sons and daughters of people who are already millionaires, because they get to inherit that wealth. None of it's taxed. Doesn't go back into none of it goes back into the government to support programs or job training or other things to help people who are living in poverty, who are kind of the victims of this new economic environment. And the focus on the individual as the ultimate unit of analysis has led to a situation where we frame all problems as issues of personal responsibility. Now, I'm not trying to say that personal responsibility isn't important. But what I am trying to say is that we no longer have a sufficient social structure of accumulation, to use another sociological term, that provides people with the resources they need in order to have upward mobility in our society. We've become less upwardly mobile. This is the challenge of our time. right now. We're seeing issues play out in Ferguson. We're seeing the Moral Monday movement happening in North Carolina. We're seeing a lot of people pushing back against this ideology because they're seeing how it's taking away resources that once went towards working class, middle class, poor people to provide them with opportunities to get ahead. And we're replacing that with what? It's kind of you're on your own mentality nowadays. And the interesting thing about this is that it's permeated our culture so much that we now take it for granted that this is the way things are and that things can't change. But I know for a fact they can. It takes a lot of work to break that mentality, to understand that there are things that tie us together as a community, as citizens in this, what used to be democracy, but is more, run by millionaires and billionaires now than ever before. The average congressman now earns over $1 million per year. The average American is around $50,000 per year. So if you're talking about a representative government, at least in terms of social class, it's not very representative. 17% of elected officials at the federal level are women. 52% of the population are women. That doesn't sound very representative to me. You can say the same thing for the racial breakdown of who represents us. As campaigns have become more expensive, only people who have those economic means can run, which oftentimes involves getting to know people who have a lot of money and who have a particular political agenda that they'd like to see. But if you're not informing yourself on these issues, how are you supposed to come together to do anything about them? So, in closing, I would just like to say, reach out in your classes to your professors who have different experiences and levels of knowledge than you do to get informed. When you're in a class, sit down next to somebody that you don't know rather than sitting down next to somebody you do know and get to know them better, particularly if they're a different gender or racial background from you. Because they bring different perspectives and knowledge to the table because they've had different life experiences. Break out of the bubble that keeps us from moving forward as a community, that makes us think that everything we got is because we worked hard, and so anybody who doesn't have anything is because they're not working hard enough. There's a lot that's not being told to you when you watch traditional media, when you talk to your family, when you talk to your friends who all have basically the same amount of information that you have. Look for opportunities to break out of that bubble. Think about it if you were an alien that was coming down to observe what social life is like and what's causing the major problems in our society. Then you start to develop allies, you start to broaden your social networks, you start to become involved with organizations that are doing something about this, and you start to be able to make that difference and become the leader in the community that provides hope, opportunity, and a chance at a better life for the next generation. So, thank you for coming today. I appreciate it.